Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to the grand country houses of England, where polished silver gleams in candlelight and wealth drips from every cornice and velvet curtain. Behind the marble columns and beneath the painted ceilings, an entire world of servants moves through the shadows. They wake before dawn. They press the linens. They stand silent against the wallpaper while their betters sip tea and gossip about nothing. And among them, living in rooms no wider than closets, loving in hallways no one else remembers, are men who loved other men, footmen who touched hands in the scullery, valets who shared narrow beds in the attic, grooms who kissed in the stables when the horses were the only witnesses. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud, because they could not. I am Julian, and this is Gay Timeline, the channel that brings forgotten gay history back into the light, one quiet night at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. Have you ever wondered what it was like to fall in love below stairs, in a world where your life belonged entirely to someone else? Have you ever wondered who the footmen were writing to when they sat by candlelight in their shared attic rooms, ink-stained and exhausted? What did two valets say to each other in the dark? When the house finally slept, and they were the only ones awake? Have you ever wondered how many love letters were burned by terrified men who could not risk being caught? How many servants lost their positions, their reputations, their futures, because someone saw them holding hands in a corridor? Have you ever wondered what happened when the master of the house, the man who employed you, fed you, owned your time and your silence, was himself one of those men and recognized in you the same quiet longing he carried? Have you ever wondered how gay servants survived in a world that punished love with prison, with ruin, with exile? Have you ever wondered how they found each other at all? What it cost them to love anyway? Let us begin. The English country house was a machine. That is the first thing you need to understand. It was not a home in any sense you would recognize. It was a finely tuned instrument designed to produce one thing: the appearance of effortless, aristocratic perfection. The family who lived upstairs never cooked their own meals, never made their own beds, never dressed themselves, never opened their own doors, never lit their own fires. They floated through life as if comfort simply materialized around them by magic. The magic was servants. Dozens of them. In the great houses of the 19th century, Chatsworth, Blenheim, Woburn Abbey, you could have a staff of 50, 80, 100 people whose sole purpose was to make sure the aristocrats never had to think about survival. And those servants lived in a world entirely separate from the one upstairs. Different staircases, different doors, different floors. The family rarely saw them except as hands that appeared with trays, or figures in livery standing silent by the dining room wall. Below stairs was its own universe, and within that universe, certain roles were occupied almost exclusively by young men: footmen, valets, grooms, under-butlers, hall boys. They lived together, they worked together, they slept in the same cramped attic dormitories, 2 or 3 to a room, narrow beds separated by barely an arm's length. They spent 18-hour days in each other's company, and the work was physical, exhausting, intimate. You dressed the master of the house, you shaved him, you handled his clothing, his body, his private moments. You rode beside him on long carriage journeys. You waited in his dressing room while he slept, in case he woke and needed something. You knew every scar, every habit, every secret he kept from his wife. And if you were one of those men who loved other men, the servant world was simultaneously the most dangerous place you could be, and the only place where you might find someone like yourself. because you were invisible. That was the point. A good servant was supposed to vanish into the architecture, to become so unremarkable that the family could speak freely in front of you, as if you were furniture. And invisibility, it turns out, is a kind of protection. You could love another man if no one was looking at you in the first place. The question was whether you could survive it when someone finally did look. The law, of course, wanted you dead, or at least in prison. The Buggery Act of 1533, a delightful piece of legislation brought to you by Henry VIII, a man who certainly had no personal scandals worth mentioning, made sodomy a capital crime. You could be hanged for it. And although by the 19th century executions for sodomy had become rare, the law had not softened. It had simply shifted. In 1885, the Criminal Law Amendment Act introduced the charge of gross indecency, a conveniently vague term that could mean anything from actual intercourse to holding hands in public if the magistrate was feeling uncharitable that day. 2 years of hard labour was the standard sentence. Oscar Wilde, in 1895, would become the most famous victim of that law. But for every Oscar Wilde, whose trial was splashed across every newspaper in England, there were 100 working-class men whose names never made it past the local magistrate's log. Servants, grooms, labourers, men who had no money for lawyers, no family connections to pull strings, no public persona to defend. They were convicted quietly, imprisoned quickly, and erased from record entirely. The aristocracy, by contrast, had options. Exile to the continent was a popular choice, a sudden decision to spend several years touring Italy, the family estate conveniently located in Scotland, far from prying London eyes. A marriage of convenience arranged by helpful relatives. Wealth bought silence. Wealth bought second chances. Servants had no such luck. If you were caught, you were gone. Not just from your job, from all jobs. Your reference would be worded carefully enough that every butler and housekeeper in England would know exactly why you left. You would never work in service again. And service was not just a job. It was food, shelter, clothing, identity. Lose your position, and you lost everything. So you learned to be careful. You learned to read the signs. You learned who could be trusted and who could not. You learned that silence was the price of survival. And sometimes, very quietly, in rooms no one else visited, you learned that you were not alone. Let us talk about footmen. Footmen were the peacocks of the servant hierarchy. They were hired explicitly for their looks, tall, handsome, well-built young men who looked good in livery. They stood behind chairs at dinner parties. They opened carriage doors. They carried trays. They were ornamental, and they were very aware of it. A footman's livery could cost more than a housemaid earned in a year. Silk breeches, powdered wigs, in some of the older houses well into the 1800s, tailored coats with brass buttons polished to a mirror shine. You were decoration. You were a status symbol. You were proof that the family employing you could afford to pay a man simply to stand still and look beautiful. And because footmen were chosen for beauty, the job attracted a certain kind of young man. The kind who understood that his body was currency. The kind who knew how to pose, how to smile, how to let his gaze linger just long enough to make an impression. Not all footmen were gay, obviously, but enough were that the role gained a particular reputation. In London, by the late 19th century, footmen were known to gather in certain pubs on their half-days off. The Crown and Anchor near Leicester Square, the Princess Louise in Holborn. Places where working-class men could drink cheap beer and talk freely, away from the watchful eyes of housekeepers and butlers. And in the back rooms of those pubs, away from the main crowd, there were smaller gatherings. Men who recognized each other by glance, by gesture, by the particular way one man might touch another's shoulder when passing him a pint. These were not organized communities in any modern sense. There were no support groups, no social clubs, no public meeting spaces. What existed was informal, temporary, and always at risk. You met someone, you talked. Maybe you went somewhere quieter, maybe you never saw him again. Maybe you did, and something grew from it. Carefully, slowly, with all the caution of two people who knew that discovery meant ruin. The 1889 Cleveland Street scandal, in which a male brothel patronized by aristocrats was raided by police, exposed just how connected these networks could be. Several of the young men working at the brothel were telegraphist boys and servants, including at least 2 footmen who had left aristocratic service to work full-time in the sex trade. The scandal revealed what everyone below stairs already knew. Gay men found each other. They created spaces, however fragile, however temporary. They survived. But the Cleveland Street raid also revealed the cost. The working class men were prosecuted. The aristocrats fled to Europe. And the newspapers spent months speculating salaciously about the degeneracy of the servant class, as if the titled men paying for sex had simply been led astray by wicked underlings. This was the world footmen navigated. You could be desired and destroyed in the same breath. Valets occupied a different position entirely. A valet was not decorative. A valet was essential. He was the most trusted servant in the household, the man who handled the master's entire private life. You dressed him in the morning. You shaved him. You chose his clothes. You packed his trunks when he travelled. You accompanied him everywhere, to London, to house parties, to the continent. You knew his schedule, his correspondence, his finances. You knew which letters he burned and which he saved. You knew when he came home drunk, when he fought with his wife, when he wept alone in his dressing room after reading bad news. You were closer to him than his own family, and that closeness was intimate in ways the Victorians preferred not to examine too carefully. A good valet could earn £30 to £40 a year by the 1890s, a fortune compared to the £8 or £10 a housemaid might make. You had your own small room, not shared with other servants. You ate better food. You wore the master's cast-off clothing, which meant you dressed like a gentleman even when off duty. You occupied a strange liminal space, socially, too elevated to mingle freely with the lower servants, too clearly working class to be mistaken for gentry. And you were often alone with your employer in ways that no one else ever was. So what happened when the man you dressed, shaved, and attended to in his most private moments was himself attracted to men? It happened more often than history cares to admit. William Beckford, one of the richest men in England in the late 18th century, was exiled from society in 1784 after being caught in bed with William Courtenay, a 16-year-old aristocrat. Beckford spent the rest of his life in seclusion at his estate, Fonthill Abbey, attended by a small household staff who knew better than to gossip about what they saw. His valet, a man named Richardson, remained with him for over 20 years. The exact nature of their relationship is unrecorded, because Richardson, unlike Beckford, left no letters, no diaries, no trace in history, except his name on household account books. That is the problem with servant history. We know they existed. We know they were there. But their voices are missing. The letters they wrote were burned. The diaries they kept were destroyed. When they died, no one wrote their obituaries. No one preserved their belongings. They vanished. What survives are fragments, a court record, a dismissal noted in a household ledger, a single line in an aristocrat's diary, dismissed J today, unpleasant business. And from those fragments we have to reconstruct entire lives. But sometimes, very rarely, we get something more. In 1895, the same year Oscar Wilde was sentenced to hard labour, a young valet named Frederick Park was dismissed from service at a country estate in Kent. The reason given in the household records was vague: moral unsuitability. Park, 23 years old, had been employed by Viscount Castleton for 18 months. He had an impeccable reference from his previous employer. He was considered efficient, discreet, and well-mannered. And then, in March of 1895, he was gone. No criminal charges were filed. No public scandal erupted. Viscount Castleton's name never appeared in any newspaper. But in the private correspondence of the family, preserved by accident in an archive of estate papers. There is a single letter from the Viscount's mother to her son, dated April 2nd, 1895. I am relieved to hear the matter has been resolved quietly. It is a shame, as the young man seemed capable, but one cannot risk the reputation of the household. I trust you will be more cautious in your future selections. More cautious. That phrase does a lot of work. It suggests the Viscount had not been cautious enough. That Frederick Park had been selected for reasons that went beyond his ability to fold a cravat. That something had happened between them, or had been about to happen, and someone noticed. Frederick Park left Kent and vanished from the historical record. Viscount Castleton hired a new valet, a man in his 40s with a wife and 3 children. The household returned to normal, and we will never know what Frederick Park felt, walking away from that house with all his belongings in a single trunk, knowing that his career in service was over. We will never know if he loved the Viscount, or if the Viscount loved him, or if the whole thing was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a scandalized housekeeper. We will never know where he went next, or how he survived, or whether he ever found someone else who saw him the way he needed to be seen. All we know is that he existed, and that for 18 months he lived in a great house in Kent and dressed a man who may have looked at him the way no one else ever had. That has to be enough, because it is all we have. The stables were different. The stables were loud, dirty, and overwhelmingly male. Grooms and stable boys worked outside the carefully regulated hierarchy of the house. They answered to the head groom or the coachman, not the butler. They lived above the carriage house or in small cottages on the estate grounds. They smelled of horses, leather, and sweat. They worked with their hands, their bodies, their strength. And they were largely ignored by the family, unless a horse went lame or a carriage wheel broke, which made the stables one of the few places on an aristocratic estate where you could live somewhat freely. The work was physical and communal. You groomed horses side by side. You hauled hay together. You repaired tack in the long, quiet hours of the afternoon, sitting on overturned buckets in the dim light of the stable, talking about nothing in particular. And at night, in the rooms above the carriage house, you slept in close quarters. Sometimes 2 or 3 men to a room. Sometimes a whole row of narrow beds in a single long attic space. Privacy was non-existent, but so was scrutiny. No one upstairs cared what the grooms did as long as the horses were ready when needed. The head groom might notice if 2 of his men seemed unusually close, but unless it disrupted the work, he was unlikely to say anything. Stable culture ran on loyalty, silence, and a certain rough code of minding your own business. So if you were a young man who loved other men, the stables could be a kind of refuge. Not safe exactly. Nowhere was safe, but less dangerous than the house, where every hallway had eyes and every room had ears. In 1876, a scandal erupted at Blenheim Palace when 2 grooms were discovered together in the hayloft by a visiting coachman. The coachman reported what he had seen to the head groom, who reported it to the estate steward, who informed the Duke. Both men were dismissed immediately. No charges were filed. The Duke wanted no public attention. But the 2 grooms were given no references and told to leave Oxfordshire entirely. One of them, a man named Thomas Harding, appealed to the Duke directly, writing a letter in which he swore the coachman had misunderstood what he saw. The Duke never replied. Harding's letter survives in the Blenheim archives, a single page of desperate, careful handwriting. Your Grace, I beg you to reconsider. I have served faithfully for 4 years. I have no family to return to. I have nowhere to go. Please, I ask only for a reference so that I might find work elsewhere. I swear to you I have done nothing wrong. The letter is endorsed on the back in the Duke's hand. Denied. Thomas Harding left Blenheim Palace in June of 1876. We do not know what happened to him after that. The other groom, whose name is not recorded anywhere in the surviving documents, disappears from history entirely. Let us talk about money, because money shaped everything. A footman in the 1890s earned between £12 and £25 a year, depending on the household and his level of experience. A valet earned £30 to £40. A groom earned £10 to £15. These wages sound absurdly low by modern standards, but remember, you also received room, board, clothing in the form of livery, and in some cases, medical care. You were not paid to survive, you were paid to save. The goal for most young men in service was to work for 10 or 15 years, save every penny, and then leave to start a small business, a pub, a shop, a coaching service. Marriage was part of that plan. You needed a wife to run the business with you. You needed children to help with the work. The entire economic structure of working-class life assumed you would marry, reproduce, and build a family legacy. But what if you had no intention of marrying? What if you knew, from the time you were 15 or 16 years old, that you would never want a wife, never want children, never want the life that everyone around you assumed was inevitable? Then service became something else, not a stepping stone, but a destination. You could stay in service your entire life, moving from household to household, eventually rising to the position of butler or head groom, living comfortably in a world where no one asked why you never married, because service was your marriage. You were wedded to the household. That was explanation enough. And in that life, you could find companionship in ways that looked, to outsiders, entirely innocent. 2 older servants sharing a sitting room, a butler and his under-butler who had worked together for 20 years, a head groom and his assistant who took their half-days off together, visiting the same pub, walking the same routes through the countryside, sitting together in companionable silence. No one questioned it. Male friendship was expected. Male loyalty was admired. 2 men who lived and worked side by side for decades were simply good colleagues, close friends, brothers in arms, unless you knew what to look for, unless you understood that sometimes friendship was the only language available for love. The Victorian obsession with propriety created strange paradoxes. On one hand, any hint of sexual impropriety between men was met with horror, legal prosecution, and social destruction. On the other hand, intense same-sex friendships were not only accepted, but celebrated. Men wrote each other passionate letters full of longing and devotion. They shared beds when traveling, a common practice, purely for economy and warmth. They touched each other freely, an arm around the shoulders, a hand clasped in greeting, a pat on the back. Physical affection between men was normal. The line between acceptable and unacceptable was determined entirely by whether anyone suggested the affection was sexual. As long as you never named it, you were safe. The moment you named it, the moment anyone said out loud what everyone had been carefully not noticing, you were destroyed. So gay servants learned to live in that space between silence and visibility. You could love another man as long as you never called it love. You could sleep in the same bed as long as no one asked why. You could spend your entire life devoted to someone as long as you framed it as loyalty, duty, friendship, anything but desire. It was exhausting, it was suffocating, and it was the only option. Some households were safer than others. Everyone in service knew which families were strict and which were lenient, which butlers reported every infraction to the family and which ones handled discipline internally, which housekeepers inspected the servants' rooms daily and which ones trusted their staff to manage themselves. A servant's reputation travelled through informal networks, conversations in pubs, gossip passed between ladies' maids at house parties, letters exchanged between former colleagues. If you were looking for work, you asked around. You found out which households were tolerable and which were prisons. And very quietly, in certain circles, you might learn which households employed men like you. This was never explicit. No one ever said, "Oh, Lord so-and-so's household is full of inverts. You will fit right in." But information travelled. A footman might mention in passing that he had worked at a particular estate and found the atmosphere unusually relaxed. A valet might recommend a household where the staff were left to themselves and no one pried into personal affairs. Coded language, subtle suggestions. If you knew what to listen for, you could piece together a map. Not a safe map, nowhere was truly safe, but a map of places where you might breathe a little easier, where you might find others like yourself, where the silence was a little less suffocating. And some households were known for something else entirely, employers who were themselves discreetly gay and who staffed their homes accordingly. End at 4,000 words. Story continues. The Earl of Somerset's London townhouse in the 1880s was one of those places. Everyone knew, no one said it. The Earl himself was a bachelor in his 50s, which was unusual enough to raise eyebrows, but not scandalous in itself. Plenty of aristocrats never married, younger sons who inherited unexpectedly, men devoted to their estates or their studies, men who simply preferred solitude. The Earl of Somerset fell into none of these categories. He was social, charming, and very particular about his staff. His household employed an unusually high number of young footmen. They were rotated frequently, staying 6 months or a year before moving on to other positions with glowing references. And they were all, without exception, extraordinarily handsome. The Ton gossiped about it in the careful way the upper classes gossip about things they cannot prove. Somerset certainly has an eye for presentation, someone might say at a dinner party, and everyone would nod knowingly and change the subject. The Earl's valet, a man named George Finch, had been with him for 15 years. Finch was in his early 40s, soft-spoken, impeccably dressed, and utterly devoted to his employer. He managed the household with quiet efficiency and hired every new staff member personally. If you were a young man looking for work in service and you happened to mention to the right person that you preferred the company of men, you might, very carefully, very quietly, be told that Mr. Finch at the Earl of Somerset's was known to be fair-minded and discreet. You might be given an address where you could apply. You might be interviewed by Finch himself, who would ask you the usual questions about your experience and references, and then, at the very end, mention in passing that the household valued loyalty and silence above all else. And did you understand what that meant? If you said yes, and if Finch believed you, you might be hired, and you would find yourself in a household where the footmen smiled a little too long at each other over breakfast, where the under-butler and the third footman took their half-days off together every week without fail, where no one commented on the fact that 2 grooms shared a bed in the rooms above the carriage house because beds were expensive and space was limited, and what business was it of anyone else? This was not a safe house in any legal sense. If the police had raided the Earl of Somerset's townhouse, half the staff would have been arrested, but the police did not raid the homes of earls without extraordinary cause. Wealth was insulation, title was armour, and as long as everyone was discreet, as long as no scandal reached the newspapers, the household could exist in its own carefully maintained bubble. George Finch understood this better than anyone. He had been a footman himself once, in a household where the butler had noticed him paying too much attention to another young man, and had dismissed him without reference. Finch had spent 2 years scrambling for work, taking jobs in pubs and coaching inns, before finally finding his way into the Earl's service. The Earl had recognised something in him, that careful, quiet resilience that comes from surviving in a world that wants you gone. Finch had been promoted to valet within a year, and when the Earl's previous butler retired, Finch was given control of all household hiring. He used that power carefully. He never hired recklessly. He never created a household so obviously queer that it would draw attention. But he made sure that the young men who came to work at the townhouse were men who needed what he had needed once. A place where they could exist without constant fear, where they could look at another man without calculating the risk, where they could, for a few months or a year, simply live. Most of the footmen moved on eventually. They took the Earl's glowing reference and found positions elsewhere, often in more prestigious households where the pay was better and the future more secure. A few stayed. One of them, a young man named Thomas Barrow, worked his way up to underbutler, and remained with the household for 12 years. He and Finch were inseparable. They took their meals together, managed the household together, and when the Earl was away, which was often, as he spent half the year at his country estate, they ran the London townhouse as if it were their own. When George Finch died in 1897, Thomas Barrow was the one who sat with him. The Earl paid for a proper funeral and a headstone in Highgate Cemetery. The headstone reads, "George Finch, faithful servant and friend." It does not say what kind of friend. It does not need to. Thomas Barrow left service after Finch's death. He used his savings to open a small tobacconist's shop in Clerkenwell. He never married. He lived above the shop for 30 years, and when he died in 1929, his will left everything to a man named Edward Hale, described in the legal documents as "my companion and business partner." The shop is gone now. The building was destroyed in the Blitz, but the will survives in the London probate records. My companion and business partner. That is as close as the law would let him come to the truth. Not every household with a gay employer was a refuge. Some were traps. Power is power. And when you combine sexual desire with absolute economic control, the potential for abuse is staggering. A servant had no legal recourse against an employer. You could not sue for wrongful dismissal. You could not report mistreatment to any authority that would take you seriously. If your employer decided to proposition you, you had exactly two choices: comply or leave. And leaving without a reference meant never working in service again. Some aristocrats understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. In 1902, a footman named William Jeffreys was convicted of blackmail after threatening to expose his former employer, a baronet, for making sexual advances. Jeffreys had been employed at the baronet's estate in Surrey for 8 months. According to trial testimony, the baronet had repeatedly entered Jeffreys's room at night and made what the prosecution delicately called improper suggestions. Jeffreys had refused. The baronet, humiliated and angry, had dismissed him without reference, claiming theft. Jeffreys, desperate and furious, had written to the baronet demanding £50 in exchange for his silence about what had actually occurred. The letter was his downfall. The baronet took it straight to the police. Jeffreys was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 18 months of hard labour for attempted blackmail. The baronet's behaviour was never investigated. At trial, the defence attorney tried to argue that Jeffreys had been the victim of predatory advances and had only sought compensation for the loss of his position. The judge was unmoved. "A servant who makes accusations against his betters," the judge said in his sentencing remarks, "whether true or false, has committed a graver sin than the employer who may have momentarily forgotten himself." William Jeffreys served his full sentence. When he was released in 1904, he was 31 years old, unemployable, and broken. He died in a workhouse in 1911. The baronet suffered no consequences whatsoever. He hired a new footman the following month. This too was part of the reality of being a gay servant in an aristocratic house. You were vulnerable in ways that went beyond the law. You could be desired and discarded in the same breath. You could be used and then blamed for the using, and the system would always side with the man who paid your wages. Let us talk about the country house party, because it was a very particular kind of hell for servants. Country house parties were a staple of aristocratic life, especially in the late Victorian and Edwardian eras. A wealthy family would invite 20 or 30 guests to their estate for a long weekend, or even a week. The guests would bring their own personal servants, ladies' maids, valets, sometimes even footmen. The host family's servants would be supplemented by temporary hires to handle the extra workload. The house would be filled to bursting, shooting parties during the day, elaborate dinners at night, breakfasts that lasted until noon, tea times that required 3 services of china. For the family upstairs, it was leisure. For the servants below stairs, it was chaos. You worked 18 or 20-hour days. You dressed and undressed guests multiple times as they changed clothes for every meal and activity. You pressed linens, polished silver, hauled bathwater up 4 flights of stairs because only the family bedrooms had plumbing. You served endless courses at dinner, standing silent and statue still while the guests talked and laughed and drank themselves into stupors. Then you stayed awake even later, waiting for the guests to finally stagger off to bed so you could clean up the mess they had left behind. And in the midst of all this, you were thrown together with servants from other households. The visiting valets and ladies' maids slept in makeshift quarters, sometimes sharing rooms with the host family's staff. You ate meals together in the servants' hall. You worked side by side in the scullery, the laundry, the kitchens. You were exhausted, overworked, and surrounded by strangers. Some of those strangers might be like you, and you had perhaps 3 days to figure out who they were before everyone scattered back to their respective households across England. It was speed dating by candlelight, except the stakes were prison. But it happened anyway. Footmen flirted over breakfast. Valets exchanged glances in the corridor. A groom from one estate might strike up a conversation with a groom from another while waiting for the carriages to be called. Some of those conversations led to hurried encounters in attic rooms or empty stables. Some led to exchanged addresses, promises to write, plans to meet again if their employers' social schedules ever overlapped. Most led nowhere. You met someone. You talked. Maybe you kissed in a dark hallway while the house slept. And then the party ended and everyone went home and you never saw him again. But the possibility was intoxicating. The danger was part of the thrill. For a few days, the rigid structure of your normal life loosened just enough to let you imagine something different. And that imagination had to sustain you through months of isolation and silence. One valet, writing in a private journal that somehow survived and is now held in the archives at the London School of Economics, described a house party at a Yorkshire estate in 1908. His name was Arthur Penn, and he worked for a minor aristocrat whose papers were donated to the university by a descendant. Penn's journal was tucked inside a box of household accounts, unread for decades until a researcher stumbled across it in 2003. "Met a man tonight," Penn wrote on June 14, 1908. "Scottish accent, works for Lord E in Edinburgh, dark eyes. We talked in the boot room while everyone else was at dinner. He asked if I knew the Prince's Street Gardens. I said I had never been to Edinburgh. He said I should visit. Gave me his address. I will not write to him. It is too dangerous, but I will keep the address, just in case." There are no further entries about the Scottish valet. The address is not recorded in the journal. We do not know if Arthur Penn ever went to Edinburgh, but the fact that he wrote it down at all, that he risked putting words to paper, suggests how much that brief conversation meant to him. The Edwardian era, roughly 1901 to 1914, is often remembered as a golden age of the English country house. King Edward VII himself was famous for his house party circuit, moving from estate to estate with his entourage, hunting and eating and engaging in barely concealed extramarital affairs. The aristocracy followed his lead. It was a time of opulence, excess, and carefully orchestrated pleasure. It was also the last gasp of a dying world. The First World War would shatter the entire system within a decade. But before that happened, the Edwardian house party reached a kind of fever pitch. And within that world, certain spaces became known among gay servants as places where you might find community, however temporary. Cliveden, the Astor family's estate in Buckinghamshire, employed a staff of over 100 during house parties. The sheer size of the household meant that the below-stairs world was more anonymous, less tightly controlled. Servants from different departments rarely interacted under normal circumstances, but during parties, everyone was thrown together. A footman might find himself working alongside a hall boy he had never seen before. A groom might be asked to help in the kitchens because the regular staff were overwhelmed. And in that temporary chaos, people could slip away, meet in quiet corners, and not be missed for an hour or two. Castle Howard in Yorkshire, Chatsworth in Derbyshire, Blenheim in Oxfordshire. All of these great houses hosted parties that brought together hundreds of servants from across England. And in every one of those households, there were men who loved other men, looking for someone who understood what it meant to live in the margins. Did they find each other? Sometimes. Was it dangerous? Always. Was it worth the risk? You would have to ask them, but they are all gone now. The First World War changed everything. When war broke out in August 1914, thousands of young men in service enlisted. Footmen, grooms, hallboys, valets. They left the great houses and joined the army. Some went out of patriotism. Some went for adventure. Some went because the army paid better than service ever had. And some went because they saw the war as an escape from the suffocating restrictions of the servant world. The army was brutal, terrifying, and deadly. It was also, paradoxically, one of the few places where working-class men could form intensely close bonds without arousing suspicion. Soldiers slept in the same trenches, bathed together, held each other when they were wounded or dying. The language of wartime camaraderie made room for affection that would have been suspect in civilian life. "We were like brothers" was an acceptable way to describe a relationship that might, in some cases, have been much more. Some of those men never came home. The war killed 900,000 British soldiers. Entire generations of young working-class men were wiped out. And among them were footmen who had served at Chatsworth, grooms who had worked at Blenheim, valets who had dressed earls and viscounts and baronets in London townhouses. The ones who did come home found a different world waiting. The great houses were still there, but the money was not. The war had been ruinously expensive. Estate taxes skyrocketed, inflation destroyed savings, and the aristocracy, which had survived for centuries on inherited wealth, suddenly found itself unable to afford the lifestyle it had always taken for granted. Households that had employed 50 servants in 1914 were down to 20 by 1920, then 10, then 5. The great country estates began to close their wings, dust sheet their ballrooms, sell their art collections. Some families sold the estates entirely and moved to smaller houses in London or abroad. The age of the English country house was over, and with it went the world that had, however imperfectly, sheltered some gay men in service. But before we move past the war, we need to talk about one particular household, because its story illustrates everything about what was possible and what was lost. Wentworth Woodhouse in South Yorkshire was the largest private residence in England, bigger than Buckingham Palace. 365 rooms, one for every day of the year. The Fitzwilliam family, who owned it, were monumentally wealthy, and the household staff at its peak numbered over 100 people. The 7th Earl Fitzwilliam, who inherited the title in 1902, was a complicated man, politically liberal, privately conservative, publicly generous, personally remote. He married in 1906, a society wedding that made all the papers. His wife was beautiful, accomplished, and utterly uninterested in him. They had no children. They lived in separate wings of Wentworth Woodhouse and saw each other primarily at formal dinners. The Earl's valet was a man named Peter Houghton. He had been hired in 1903, just after the Earl inherited, and he remained in the position until the Earl's death in 1943. 40 years of service to one man. We know very little about Peter Houghton. He left no personal papers. No photographs of him survive. His name appears in household records, in account books, in a few scattered letters where the Earl mentions him in passing. Houghton has been unwell this week, so I managed my own dressing for once and made rather a hash of it. Houghton accompanied me to London and proved as invaluable as ever. That is all we have. 40 years of daily intimacy, and the only evidence is a handful of sentences in someone else's letters. But there is one other thing. When the 7th Earl Fitzwilliam died in 1943, his will included a bequest of £500 to Peter Houghton, along with a cottage on the estate rent-free for the remainder of his life. £500 was an extraordinary sum for a servant's bequest, the equivalent of 10 years' wages. The cottage was even more unusual. Most servants who retired were simply pensioned off with a small income and expected to find their own lodging. Peter Houghton lived in that cottage until his own death in 1951. He never married. The cottage was left, according to estate records, furnished as it was during his occupancy, and the family allowed a cousin of Houghton's to live there for a few years afterward. When the cousin moved out, the contents were dispersed or destroyed. No inventory was ever made, so we will never know what Peter Houghton kept in that cottage. We will never know what letters he saved, what photographs he tucked into drawers, what memories he held onto from 40 years of serving a man who gave him a home for life. But £500 and a cottage, that bequest says something. It says you mattered. It says, I could not acknowledge you publicly, but I can make sure you are cared for after I am gone. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is something. After the First World War, service as a career became less and less viable. The younger generation did not want it. Why would you work 18-hour days for £10 a year when you could get a factory job for better wages, or join the civil service, or open a shop? The mystique was gone. The deference was gone. The great houses were crumbling, and everyone knew it. By the 1930s, the aristocracy was hiring married couples instead of large staffs. A butler and housekeeper who lived together and managed the household between them. A cook and a chauffeur. A lady's maid who also cleaned. The elaborate hierarchies of the Victorian and Edwardian eras collapsed into something leaner, more practical, less romantic. And for gay men, this shift was a disaster. The married couple model left no room for you. You could not be a butler without a housekeeper wife. You could not live in service long term without raising questions about why you had never married. The spaces that had once existed for lifelong bachelor servants, the valets who devoted themselves to one employer, the footmen who moved from house to house, the grooms who lived above the stables with their companions. All of those spaces closed. Some men adapted. They married women, sometimes in genuine partnerships of convenience, sometimes in miserable pretense. They took jobs outside service. They moved to cities where anonymity was easier. They disappeared into the margins. And some men simply stayed where they were, aging in place in the few great houses that still maintained traditional staffs, knowing they were relics of a world that no longer existed. There is a photograph from 1936, taken at Chatsworth, showing the remaining household staff lined up for a formal portrait. There are 12 of them, where once there had been 50. They are all older. The youngest is in his 40s, and in the back row, standing slightly apart, are 2 men in their 60s, the head butler and the under butler, who had worked together at Chatsworth since 1898. Their names were Henry Cavendish, no relation to the family, just a coincidence of surname, and James Ridley. They had served the 9th Duke of Devonshire for nearly 40 years. They lived in adjoining rooms in the servants' quarters. They took their meals together. They walked the estate grounds together on their half-days off. Everyone at Chatsworth knew they were inseparable. When Henry Cavendish died in 1939, James Ridley resigned from service immediately. He moved to a boarding house in Buxton and lived there for another 15 years. He never worked again. The 10th Duke sent him a small pension every quarter, a private arrangement never recorded in any official documents. James Ridley died in 1954. His landlady, interviewed years later by a local historian researching Chatsworth's staff history, remembered him as a quiet man who kept to himself. He had a photograph on his mantelpiece, she said. 2 men in butler's livery, standing in front of a grand house. I asked him once who they were. He said, "That is my friend Henry and myself, a long time ago." He dusted that photograph every single day. Let us talk about what survival looked like in practical terms. If you were a gay servant in the 19th or early 20th century, you developed a set of skills that had nothing to do with polishing silver or pressing clothes. You learned to read people. You learned to gauge who was safe and who was dangerous. You learned to speak in coded language, to communicate with glances and gestures, to have entire conversations that meant one thing to outsiders and something entirely different to the person you were actually talking to. You learned the geography of safety, which corridors were watched and which were not, which rooms had locks and which did not, which times of day the housekeeper made her rounds, which nights the butler stayed up late doing accounts, which mornings the family slept in and the house was briefly, blissfully unsupervised. You learned to leave no evidence, no letters saved, or if you did save letters, they were carefully worded to sound like ordinary friendship. No diaries kept, or if you kept a diary, you wrote in vague pronouns and euphemisms. No photographs taken together, or if a photograph existed, you made sure you were standing at a respectable distance, formal and unremarkable. You learned to cultivate useful ignorance in others. If another servant suspected something, you made sure they also had reasons to keep quiet, because you knew their secrets too, or because they owed you favors, or because you had been kind to them when someone else was cruel, and they remembered that kindness. You learned to disappear into routine, to be so reliable, so competent, so essential to the smooth running of the household that no one wanted to look too closely at your private life, because losing you would be inconvenient. And you learned to live with loneliness, because even if you found someone, even if you built something that felt like love, you could never fully relax into it. You could never be certain it would last. You could never stop calculating the risk. That is what survival looked like, and thousands of men did it. They survived. We just do not know most of their names. Continue at 4,000 words. Story not concluded. The letters that do survive tell us something about how these men spoke to each other when they thought no one was listening. In 1923, a trunk was discovered in the attic of a house in Bloomsbury that was being cleared after the death of its elderly occupant. The trunk belonged to a man named Walter Grimsby, who had died at 73 with no living relatives. Inside were the usual things: clothing, a few books, some household items, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, were 47 letters spanning 30 years. The letters were from a man who signed himself only as R. They were addressed to Walter at various locations across England, different households where Walter had worked as a valet. The letters were chatty, full of domestic details about R's own work, complaints about difficult employers, gossip about other servants they both knew. To a casual reader, they would have seemed entirely innocent. Just two friends keeping in touch over the years. But if you read carefully, the pattern emerged. I think of our last meeting often, and wish circumstances permitted more frequent reunions. Your photograph sits on my shelf, and I confess I speak to it sometimes when the loneliness becomes too much. I dreamt of you last night, and woke wishing the dream had been real. Nothing explicit. Nothing that could be used as evidence in court. But the longing in those letters is unmistakable. R and Walter had worked together in the same household once, early in their careers. They had been separated when Walter took a better position elsewhere, and for 3 decades afterward, they had maintained a correspondence that was the closest thing to a relationship either of them could have. The letters ended in 1921. The last one R sent said, "I am sorry to hear of your illness. I wish I could be there to care for you, but my employer requires me here. Please write when you are able. I remain, as always, your devoted friend." There is no record of what happened to R. The letters give no surname, no address that can be traced. He existed in Walter Grimsby's life for 30 years, and then he vanished into history with nothing but the letter R to mark his passing. The trunk and its contents were donated to the Museum of London by the landlord who found them. The letters are in the museum's archives now, catalogued under Personal Correspondence, Early 20th Century. They are available to researchers by appointment. Almost no one looks at them. The relationship between male servants was scrutinized differently, depending on where you fell in the hierarchy. 2 footmen who seemed too friendly would be watched carefully by the butler and housekeeper. Footmen were young, decorative, and temporary. They were expected to flirt with the housemaids, to have dalliances, to eventually marry and leave service. If they showed no interest in women, and too much interest in each other, that was noted. The housekeeper might separate them, assigning them different duties so they rarely worked together. The butler might speak to one of them privately, a conversation that never happened officially, but was understood by everyone to be a warning. But two older male servants, a butler and his under-butler, a head groom and his assistant, two valets who worked for brothers in the same family, could be as close as they wanted, and no one thought twice about it. The older you got in service, the more your bachelor status was simply accepted as the price of your career. You had devoted your life to your work. You had no time for marriage. Of course, you formed close bonds with the colleagues you lived and worked alongside for decades. That was natural. That was expected. So if you wanted to build a life with another man, your best strategy was to survive long enough to become invisible, to reach the age where your relationship could be read as professional partnership, not romantic entanglement, to become so embedded in the household structure that you were inseparable from it, and separating you from your companion would mean disrupting the entire system. Some men achieved this. The historical record shows dozens of examples. Two male servants who worked together for 20, 30, 40 years, who retired together or died within months of each other, whose obituaries listed each other as closest friend or longtime companion. We cannot know for certain which of these relationships were romantic and which were simply deep friendship. The men themselves likely would not have drawn such a clear distinction. What mattered was that they had each other, that they were not alone. One pair deserves particular attention, not because they were exceptional, but because their story was so ordinary that it represents thousands of others. Albert Morris and Sidney Webb both started their careers as hall boys in large London households in the 1870s. They met in 1881 at a servants' employment registry, a kind of job agency where servants could list their qualifications and households could advertise positions. Both were looking for work after their previous employers had closed their London houses for the season. They struck up a conversation in the waiting room. They were both 21 years old. Albert was hired as a junior footman at a house in Belgravia. Sidney found a position as under-butler in Kensington. They exchanged addresses. They met on their shared half-day off, which was Thursday for both of them. They walked through Hyde Park, ate meat pies from a vendor, talked about their work, their ambitions, their frustrations with the rigid hierarchy of service life. This went on for 3 months. Then Albert's employer decided to economize and dismissed half the staff. Albert was let go with a week's wages and a perfunctory reference. He was unemployed for 6 weeks, an eternity when you have no savings and no family to fall back on. He took a temporary position as a waiter in a chop house, which paid almost nothing and had no accommodation included. He slept in a boarding house where 6 men shared a single room and spent every spare moment searching for a proper position in service. Sidney lent him money. Not much. An under-butler didn't earn much to begin with, but enough to keep Albert fed and housed until he found work. When Albert finally secured a position as footman in a Mayfair household, he paid Sidney back over the course of 6 months, a few shillings at a time. That debt created a bond. They both knew Albert could have disappeared, never repaid the money, and Sidney would have had no recourse. But Albert didn't disappear. He paid back every penny, and Sidney never once asked for it. That mutual trust meant something. They continued meeting on Thursdays. As they both rose through the ranks of their respective households, their half-days occasionally shifted, but they adjusted. If Albert had Wednesday off and Sidney had Friday, they met on Sunday evenings instead, after the dinner service was finished. They found each other. That was what mattered. In 1889, Sidney was promoted to head butler in a household in Hampstead. The position came with the authority to hire his own under-butler. He offered the position to Albert. Albert accepted immediately. They worked together for the next 34 years. The household they served was owned by a textile merchant named Mr. Ashford, who had made a fortune in the cotton trade and bought his way into respectability through property and political donations. Ashford was not nobility. He was nouveau riche, which meant his household operated with slightly less rigid formality than an aristocratic estate. The staff was smaller, the atmosphere less oppressive. Ashford himself was often away on business, which left Sidney and Albert to manage the house largely on their own. They were good at it. The household ran smoothly. Staff turnover was low, which was unusual. Most servants changed positions every year or two, chasing better wages or better conditions. But the people who worked under Sidney and Albert tended to stay. The work was demanding but fair. The rules were clear. And the two men at the top seemed genuinely to care about the people working beneath them, which was rare enough to inspire loyalty. Sidney and Albert lived in separate rooms on the same floor of the servants' quarters. Their rooms shared a connecting door. Officially, this door was for convenience, so the butler and under-butler could confer privately about household matters without having to walk through the corridor. In practice, the door was unlocked every night. Everyone on staff knew. The housemaids whispered about it occasionally, in the way that servants gossip about everything and everyone. But no one ever reported it, and no one ever made trouble. Sidney and Albert were respected. They were kind, and they made sure the household staff were treated well. Proper meals, reasonable work hours, time off when promised, fair wages. That loyalty went both ways. When Mr. Ashford died in 1923, his widow sold the house and dismissed the staff. Sidney was 63. Albert was 63. They were too old to find new positions easily, and they had no interest in separating after 34 years. Sidney's savings were modest but sufficient. They rented a small flat in Finsbury Park, 2 rooms on the 3rd floor of a boarding house. They lived there together for the next 15 years. The landlady who rented them the flat assumed they were brothers. They never corrected her. It was easier that way. And in some sense, it was true, not biologically, but in every way that mattered. They had lived as family for longer than many marriages lasted. Albert died in 1938. Sidney followed 6 months later. Their death certificates list different causes. Albert's heart gave out. Sidney had pneumonia. But the landlady told the local vicar, who recorded it in the parish notes, that Sidney simply lost the will to live after Albert was gone. He stopped eating, the landlady said, just sat in his chair and stared at the wall. I brought him soup, but he wouldn't touch it. He was waiting, I think, waiting to follow his brother. They are buried in the same cemetery, though not side by side. Their graves are 3 rows apart. There was no money for a family plot, and no family left to purchase one. The headstones are simple. Albert Morris, 1860–1938. Sidney Webb, 1860–1939. No epitaphs, no mention of their life together. But they had 34 years. In a world designed to keep them apart, they found a way to build something that lasted. That is worth remembering. Let us talk about the servants who did not survive. Because for every story of 2 men who found each other and built a life, there are a dozen stories of men who were caught, punished, and erased. The court records from the Victorian and Edwardian eras are full of them. Prosecutions under the sodomy laws and later the gross indecency statutes. Most of the men convicted were working class. Many were servants. Their trials were brief, their sentences harsh, and their names appeared in local newspapers just long enough to destroy them before they disappeared from public record entirely. In 1898, a groom named Frederick Atkinson was sentenced to 2 years hard labour after being discovered with another man in the stables of a Yorkshire estate. The trial transcript is brutally brief. Atkinson was 24 years old. He had worked at the estate for 3 years with an excellent record. The man he was caught with was a visiting groom from another household, in town for a shooting party. Both men were prosecuted. The visiting groom, whose employer was a baronet, received 6 months. Frederick Atkinson, whose employer was only a wealthy landowner, received 2 years. The trial transcript notes that Atkinson wept in the dock and begged the judge for leniency. "I have nowhere to go," he said. "My family disowned me. I will starve if you send me to prison." The judge responded, "You should have considered that before you chose to engage in such vile behavior. Perhaps prison will teach you the error of your ways." Frederick Atkinson was released from prison in 1900. There is no further record of him. He does not appear in any census data, any employment records, any parish registers. He vanished. Either he changed his name, or he emigrated, or he died shortly after release. We will never know. That was the gamble every gay servant took. You might find love, you might build a life, or you might be caught, and everything you had worked for, your position, your reputation, your future, would be gone in an instant, and the law would not protect you. Society would not mourn you. You would simply cease to exist in any meaningful way. How many Frederick Atkinsons were there? How many men lost everything because they dared to love? The court records give us a glimpse, but only a glimpse. For every man prosecuted, there were surely dozens who were dismissed quietly, their employers choosing to handle the matter privately rather than risk scandal. Those men left no trace at all. The language servants used to talk about same-sex desire was necessarily coded. You could not say, "I am attracted to men," in any context where you might be overheard. So you developed euphemisms, phrases that meant one thing on the surface and something else to those in the know. "He is musical" was one. It implied sensitivity, artistic temperament, a certain refinement, qualities associated, in the popular imagination, with effeminacy and therefore with homosexuality. If someone told you a particular footman was very musical, you understood that to mean he might be open to certain conversations. A confirmed bachelor was another, though this one was used more broadly and could simply mean a man who had chosen not to marry for perfectly conventional reasons. Still, in certain contexts, it carried weight. "He is a confirmed bachelor, and I think he prefers it that way." Good friends, or particular friends, were phrases that could describe any close relationship, but when applied to two men who lived together, worked together, and showed no interest in women, the meaning became sharper. They are particular friends, you know, very devoted to one another. The upper classes had their own coded language. Oscar Wilde's circles spoke of "the love that dare not speak its name," borrowed from a poem by Lord Alfred Douglas. But servants did not quote poetry. They could not afford to be literary about it. Their coded language was blunter, more practical. You said enough to be understood by the right people, and not enough to be reported by the wrong ones. And sometimes you said nothing at all. You just knew. You recognized something in the way another man looked at you, the way he held your gaze a fraction of a second too long, the way he found excuses to stand near you or brush past you in the corridor. And you made a choice: acknowledge it or ignore it. Either way carried risk. The blackmail threat was constant. Once someone knew your secret, you were vulnerable forever. Some men used this power cruelly. A servant who knew that two of his colleagues were involved could demand money, better treatment, favorable work assignments. If they refused, he could threaten to report them, and the threat was real. Even if the accusation could not be proven in court, the mere suggestion was enough to get you dismissed. This happened with sickening regularity. The historical record is full of blackmail cases where servants extorted each other, though many never made it to court because the victims had no recourse. If you paid the blackmailer, you might keep your position. If you refused, you lost everything anyway. Either way, you suffered. In 1907, a case went to trial in Manchester that illustrated the dynamics perfectly. A footman named James Hartley accused his fellow footman, David Price, of making advances toward him. Hartley claimed Price had entered his room one night and attempted to kiss him, and that when Hartley refused, Price had threatened to say Hartley had made advances toward him instead. Confused by this double accusation, the household steward reported both men to the police. The trial was a disaster. Both men accused each other. There was no physical evidence, no witnesses, just two men pointing fingers and insisting the other was lying. The jury, baffled and frustrated, convicted both men of gross indecency on the logic that something improper must have occurred, even if they could not determine who initiated it. Each received 18 months of hard labor. The household that employed them issued a statement to the local newspaper expressing shock and dismay that such men had been hired in the first place and promising a more thorough vetting process in the future. The statement ended with, "Decent Christian families must be protected from the moral corruption that these individuals represent." James Hartley and David Price were both 26 years old. The trial destroyed them equally. Perhaps that was the point. Not all households were hostile. Some families genuinely cared about their servants and tried, within the limits of the law and social convention, to protect them. Lady Ottoline Morell, a literary hostess and aristocrat who moved in Bloomsbury circles, was known for her tolerance and her willingness to employ servants who might have struggled to find work elsewhere. Her household at Garsington Manor in Oxfordshire included several gay men, and while Ottoline never spoke openly about their sexuality, that would have been socially impossible. She made sure they were treated fairly and defended when necessary. One of her footmen, a young man named Philip Davenport, was propositioned by a male guest at a house party in 1915. The guest, a wealthy industrialist, assumed that a handsome young footman would be available for the right price. When Philip refused, the guest complained to Lady Ottoline, claiming Philip had been insolent and inappropriate. Ottoline spoke to Philip privately. He told her the truth, that the guest had offered him money to spend the night with him, and that Philip had declined as politely as possible. Ottoline believed him. She confronted the guest, told him his behaviour was unacceptable, and asked him to leave Garsington immediately. The guest, outraged, threatened to spread rumours about the household. Ottoline told him that if he did, she would make sure every hostess in England knew exactly why he had been asked to leave. The guest left quietly. Philip Davenport remained at Garsington until 1918, when he enlisted in the army. He survived the war and returned briefly to service before opening a bookshop in Oxford in 1921. He sent Lady Ottoline a letter thanking her for her kindness and for believing him when it mattered. The letter survives in the Ottoline Morell papers at the British Library. "You were the only employer who ever treated me as a human being rather than a piece of furniture," he wrote. "I will never forget that." But families like the Morells were rare. Most aristocrats would have sided with the guest, not the servant. The default assumption was that working-class men were morally suspect, and that any accusation against them was probably true. Servants had no credibility, no social standing, no power. That was the reality most gay servants lived with every single day. The transition from the Edwardian era into the interwar period brought massive social changes that affected servants profoundly. The rigid class system that had kept everyone in their assigned place for centuries began to crack. The Labour Party gained political power. Unions organised. Women won the vote. The working class started demanding better wages, better hours, better treatment. For gay servants, these changes were a mixed blessing. On one hand, the decline of the great households meant fewer positions available, and the positions that remained were less secure. On the other hand, the loosening of social rigidity meant more options outside of service. You could move to a city and find work in a factory, an office, a shop. You could live anonymously in a way that had never been possible in the insular world of the country estate. London, in particular, became a refuge. The city had always had spaces where gay men gathered, certain pubs, certain streets, certain parks where you could meet others like yourself. These spaces were dangerous, constantly raided by police, but they existed. And as the population of London grew and the city became more chaotic and anonymous, those spaces multiplied. Some former servants ended up there. Men who had left service, either voluntarily or because they had been dismissed, found their way to London and tried to build new lives. Some succeeded. Many did not. The city was expensive, and without the structure of a household providing food and lodging, survival was difficult. There are occasional glimpses of these men in social welfare records from the 1920s and 30s. A man seeking assistance from a charitable organisation, listing his previous occupation as valet or footman, now unemployed and living in a boarding house in Whitechapel or Bethnal Green. A man arrested for soliciting in a public lavatory, his background noted in police records as formerly in service. A man admitted to a workhouse infirmary, dying of tuberculosis or syphilis or simple starvation, his last words recorded by a nurse. "I used to work in a fine house. I had a position once." These are fragments, shards of broken lives, but they are all we have. Let us talk about the halls themselves, the physical spaces where these men lived and worked. The servants' quarters in a great house were designed to be invisible from the family's perspective. Separate staircases, narrow, steep, undecorated, led up to the attics where servants slept and down to the basements where they worked. The family never used these staircases. They never saw the cramped rooms, the shared bathrooms, the narrow beds, out of sight, out of mind. A footman's room in a typical Victorian country house might be 8 feet by 10 feet, a narrow bed, a small wardrobe for your livery, a washstand with a basin and pitcher. If you were lucky, a chair. If you were very lucky, a small desk. The walls were plain plaster, unpapered. The floor was bare wood. There was one small window, often overlooking the courtyard or the rooftops, never the gardens. Heat was minimal. A shared fireplace at the end of the corridor that barely warmed the rooms in winter. You shared this corridor with other male servants. Footmen, valets, hall boys, grooms if the estate had no separate carriage house. The rooms were close together, the walls thin. You could hear your neighbours breathing, coughing, snoring. Privacy was theoretical at best. And yet, within those constraints, men found ways to be together. A door left unlocked. A quiet knock in the middle of the night. An hour stolen before dawn, before the house woke and the work began. It required coordination, courage, and absolute trust. One person waking at the wrong time, one suspicious housekeeper making an unexpected round, and you were finished. The attics of these great houses still exist. Many of them are open to tourists now. You can walk through Chatsworth or Castle Howard or Audley End and see the servants' quarters, carefully preserved or recreated. The rooms are small, as you expected. The beds are narrow, the furniture sparse. The signs explain that 15 or 20 servants might have lived on this single floor, sharing a bathroom, eating meals in the servants' hall below. What the signs do not tell you is that some of those servants loved each other, that they held hands in these narrow corridors, that they kissed in these small rooms, knowing that discovery meant ruin, that they built lives in the shadows of these great houses, lives that were real and meaningful, even if history chose to ignore them. The rooms remember, the walls remember, we just have to listen. End at 4,000 words. Story continues. The architecture itself was designed to enforce separation. Between the family and the servants, yes, but also between different categories of servants. Male and female servants were kept rigorously apart. The housemaids slept in one wing of the attic, the footmen in another, with the housekeepers' rooms positioned between them like a checkpoint. This was about propriety, about preventing what the Victorians called improper relationships. A housemaid getting pregnant by a footman was a household scandal, grounds for immediate dismissal of both parties. But the irony is that this enforced separation of the sexes created spaces where men lived entirely among other men for months or years at a time. The footmen's corridor, the groom's quarters above the stable block, the valet's rooms clustered near the master bedrooms. These were homosocial spaces by design, and within them, certain kinds of relationships could develop that might never have formed in a mixed environment. A young footman arriving at his first position would find himself immediately immersed in an all-male world. He ate meals with other footmen. He worked alongside them all day. He shared a room, or at minimum a corridor, with them at night. The older footman taught him the work, showed him how to polish silver properly, how to serve at table without being noticed, how to stand for hours without fidgeting. And in the process, they taught him the unspoken rules of the household's male culture. Some households had cultures of casual physical affection between male servants, roughhousing, wrestling, the kind of physical contact that coded as masculine camaraderie. Other households were more reserved, more formal, with strict rules about personal space and proper behavior. You learned quickly which kind of household you had landed in. And if you were gay, you learned to read the subtle signs that might indicate whether any of the other men in that space were like you. The way someone watched you when he thought you were not looking. The way conversation shifted when certain topics came up. The jokes that were told, and who laughed at them, and who went quiet. It was an education by immersion, and it could save your life or ruin it, depending on how carefully you learned. The hierarchies within the male servant world were intricate and absolute. At the top, the butler. Then the valet to the master of the house. Then the under-butler. Then the head footman. Then the first footman, second footman, third footman, however many the household employed. Below them, hall boys, boot boys, lamp boys, the children and teenagers doing menial work while they learned the trade. Where you fell in this hierarchy determined everything. How much you were paid, what you ate. Senior servants dined on better food than junior servants. Where you sat at table, whether you had a private room or shared one, whether you could go out on your half day without asking permission. It also determined who you could have a relationship with. A butler pursuing a hall boy would have been seen as an abuse of power, grotesque and predatory. Even if the hall boy was willing, the power differential was too extreme. But two footmen of similar age and rank? That was different. Still dangerous, still illegal, but not an abuse of authority in the same way. The servant hierarchy was obsessed with maintaining proper distance between ranks. A first footman would never socialize casually with a hall boy. It would undermine the structure. But he might develop a close friendship with the second footman, his equal in all but seniority. They might take their half-days together, visit pubs together, share confidences. And if that friendship deepened into something else, they could navigate it on relatively equal footing. Some relationships crossed hierarchical lines anyway. A valet and a footman, a butler and an under-butler. These were complicated by the power dynamics, but they happened. The older man had more security, more money, more authority. The younger man was more vulnerable, more dependent. Whether this created exploitation or partnership depended entirely on the individuals involved and the ethics they brought to it. We know these relationships existed because occasionally they appear in disciplinary records. Dismiss the under-butler for improper familiarity with the third footman. The language is always vague, always coded, but the meaning is clear enough. Something was happening that the housekeeper or butler considered inappropriate, and someone had to go. Usually it was the younger, lower-ranking servant who was dismissed. The older man might be reprimanded, might lose his authority to hire or supervise junior staff, but he kept his position. The system protected rank above all else. Let us talk about the physical toll of living in constant fear, because that is what it was. Every single day, for years on end, you lived with the knowledge that one wrong move, one careless word, one moment of being seen by the wrong person at the wrong time could end everything. The stress of that existence is difficult to overstate. You could not relax, ever. You could not let your guard down. Even in moments of intimacy with someone you trusted, there was always the awareness that someone might hear through the thin walls, that someone might notice you were both absent at the same time, that someone might put the pieces together. Some men coped by becoming hypervigilant. They memorized the household's rhythms so completely that they always knew where everyone else was at any given moment. They developed elaborate systems of signals and codes to communicate safely. They planned every interaction, every meeting, with military precision. Other men coped by compartmentalizing. They split their lives into pieces. The public self who performed his duties flawlessly and showed no sign of inner life. The private self who existed only in stolen moments. They became so good at this division that even they sometimes forgot where the performance ended and the real person began. And some men simply broke under the strain. They made mistakes. They got careless. Or they reached a point where they decided they no longer cared about the consequences, where the exhaustion of hiding outweighed the fear of exposure. The servant mental health crisis of the late Victorian era is well documented, though rarely discussed in these terms. Anxiety, depression, insomnia, mysterious physical ailments that doctors could not explain. Some of this was due to overwork and poor living conditions, but some of it surely was the psychological cost of living a lie every single day. There are records of servants who simply walked away from their positions without explanation. Here one day, gone the next, leaving behind all their belongings and forfeiting their wages. The household records note these disappearances with frustration. The second footman absconded without notice, most inconvenient, but never investigate why. They simply hired someone else and moved on. Where did those men go? Some probably found other work. Some probably left England entirely, emigrating to America or Australia or Canada, where they might reinvent themselves. And some probably did not survive. The suicide rate among young working-class men in Victorian England was high, and we have no way of knowing how many of those suicides were driven by the specific desperation of being gay in a world that criminalized your existence. The culture of references made escape nearly impossible. When you left a position, you needed a written reference from your employer, a letter stating that you had worked there, describing your duties and assessing your character and competence. Without a good reference, you could not get another position in service, and without work in service, you had very limited options. This system gave employers enormous power. If you were dismissed for cause, theft, drunkenness, insubordination, or that catch-all phrase, moral unsuitability, your employer could choose to give you no reference at all, or a reference worded so carefully that any prospective employer would immediately understand you were trouble. John Smith worked in this household for 6 months. I can say nothing further. That kind of reference was a death sentence for your career. Every butler and housekeeper in England knew how to read between those lines, so when gay servants were caught, they faced an impossible choice. If the employer prosecuted them criminally, they went to prison and emerged with a criminal record that made employment anywhere nearly impossible. If the employer dismissed them quietly to avoid scandal, they were left with no reference, which had almost the same effect. Either way, your life in service was over. Some employers, out of pity or residual fondness, would provide a minimal reference that allowed the dismissed servant to find work somewhere else, usually in a lower position and for less pay. James Brown served adequately as footman. He is seeking a position as hall boy or kitchen assistant. The demotion was humiliating, but at least it was survival. And very occasionally, an employer who was himself gay or who sympathized for other reasons would provide a glowing reference even to a servant dismissed for homosexual behavior, as long as the servant agreed to leave the area entirely. Go to another county, another city, somewhere far enough away that the scandal would not follow. Start over. Say nothing about what happened. The reference will say you left of your own accord to pursue better opportunities. No one else needs to know. This happened more often than the historical record shows, because both parties had every reason to keep quiet about it. But there are hints. Servants who show up in one region's employment records, vanish for a few years, then reappear in a completely different part of England, with their work history oddly vague about the intervening time. Gaps that cannot quite be explained. Those gaps are where the secrets lived. The advent of photography in the mid-19th century created both opportunity and danger for gay servants. Photographs were expensive, so they were taken primarily for special occasions or by people wealthy enough to afford regular sittings. Servants rarely appeared in photographs except as part of large household group portraits. The entire staff lined up formally for the camera, a record of the household at a particular moment in time. But some servants did have personal photographs taken. A young man might sit for a portrait when he first entered service, to send home to his family or to keep as a memento of his youth. Two friends might have a photograph taken together on their half-day at one of the commercial studios that catered to working-class customers in major cities. And very rarely, two men who loved each other might have a photograph taken together, knowing it was dangerous, knowing they could never display it openly, but wanting some tangible proof that their relationship had existed. These photographs, when they survive, are extraordinarily precious. They are also nearly impossible to identify with certainty. Two men in Victorian or Edwardian dress, standing side by side, unsmiling in the formal style of the era. Are they friends, colleagues, brothers, or lovers who could never say so? Sometimes there are clues. They are standing closer than formal convention would dictate. One man's hand rests on the other's shoulder in a way that suggests intimacy. Their expressions, despite the stiffness required by long exposure times, convey something, a softness, a connection, a shared secret. But mostly, we just do not know. And the men in the photographs are long dead, unable to tell us what they meant to each other. One such photograph surfaced in a house clearance in Devon in 2008. Two men in servants' livery, circa 1890s, standing in front of a painted backdrop of a country garden. They are not touching, but they are angled toward each other, their bodies forming a closed unit that excludes the viewer. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, James and Thomas, 1894. No surnames, no location, no other information. The photograph was purchased by a collector of Victorian photography and is now part of a private collection. James and Thomas exist in that single frozen moment, forever young, forever together, forever unknowable. The role of the valet deserves deeper examination because it was the most intimate position a male servant could hold, and therefore the most complicated for gay men. A valet's duties were profoundly physical. You dressed your employer, which meant handling his body. You helped him into his clothes, buttoned his shirts, tied his cravat, adjusted his collar. You shaved him, which required touching his face, his neck, tilting his head to get the angle right. You brushed his hair, you trimmed his nails, you attended him in his bath, not scrubbing him, that would be too much, but laying out towels, testing the water temperature, handing him soap. If your employer was injured or ill, you might help him to bed, assist him with the chamber pot, change his linens. The intimacy was unavoidable. You knew his body as well as a wife might, better in some cases, because you saw him in moments of vulnerability that he carefully hid from his wife. For a straight valet, this was simply the job, professional, emotionally neutral, no different from a physician examining a patient. But for a gay valet, especially a young gay valet attending a handsome employer, the situation was fraught with danger. You had to perform these intimate acts without ever, for even a moment, betraying that you might find the man you were touching attractive. One flicker of inappropriate attention. One moment where your hands lingered too long. One glance that communicated desire instead of professional competence. And you were finished. So you learned to dissociate. To treat the body you were handling as an object, not a person. To think about something else entirely while you shaved him, while you buttoned his shirt, while you stood close enough to smell his cologne and the warmth of his skin. You trained yourself not to feel, because feeling was too dangerous. Some valets managed this successfully for entire careers. Others struggled with it constantly, living in a state of perpetual low-level torture, touching someone every day whom they desired and could never have. And then there were the situations where the employer was also gay, where the intimacy was mutual, where the touching was charged with meaning on both sides. This could go several ways. In the best cases, it led to a relationship of genuine affection and discretion. The employer and valet became lovers while maintaining the professional facade. They were careful, they were subtle, and they survived for years or decades without being caught. These relationships existed in the historical record only as hints. A valet who remained with one employer for 40 years and never married. An employer who never dismissed his valet despite multiple opportunities to hire younger, cheaper staff. Bequests in wills that were far more generous than professional service alone would warrant. In the worst cases, it led to exploitation. The employer used his power to coerce sexual favors from a valet who could not afford to refuse. The valet endured because the alternative was unemployment and ruin. When the employer tired of him, he was dismissed. Sometimes with a reference, sometimes without, depending on the employer's cruelty or guilt. And sometimes the valet had the power. If he knew the employer was gay, and the employer knew that he knew, the valet could use that knowledge to secure better treatment, more money, more freedom. This was not quite blackmail. It was subtler than that, but it was leverage. I am loyal and I am silent, and my loyalty and silence are worth paying for. The employment relationship between a gay valet and a gay employer was never simple. It was always negotiated, always contingent, always shadowed by the knowledge that exposure would destroy them both. The letters of E.M. Forster, the novelist, provide an unusual window into these dynamics. Forster was gay, closeted for most of his life, and fascinated by working-class men. He had relationships with several, including a policeman named Bob Buckingham, who remained his companion for decades. But before Buckingham, there were others, men Forster met casually and pursued cautiously, always aware of the class divide between them. In 1915, Forster met a young soldier named Ernest Mertz. They had a brief affair. Mertz was working class, had been in service before the war, and was completely open with Forster about his experiences. In one letter, Mertz described his time as a footman in a large household, where several of the male servants were involved with each other. He wrote about it matter-of-factly, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. There were 4 of us, Mertz wrote. We looked out for each other. If one of us was in trouble, the others covered for him. That is how you survived. You found your people, and you protected each other. Forster saved this letter. It is now in the Forster Archive at King's College, Cambridge, along with dozens of others. The archive was sealed until 1971 per Forster's instructions because he knew the contents would have destroyed his reputation during his lifetime. Ernest Mertz was killed in France in 1916. He was 23. Forster mourned him privately and used what Mertz had told him as material for his novel Maurice, which he wrote in 1913-14, but did not publish until 1971 after his death. Maurice is about a gay man falling in love with a gamekeeper, crossing class lines to find happiness. It was Forster's fantasy of what might be possible. But the real men whose lives inspired the fantasy did not get happy endings. They got prison sentences, dismissals, exile, silence, and early deaths. Forster knew this. That is why he never published the novel while he was alive. He knew the world was not ready to hear that story told with sympathy. The language of flowers was sometimes used by gay men in service to communicate. This was a broader Victorian practice. Flowers had assigned meanings, and giving someone a particular flower or arrangement conveyed a message. Red roses meant romantic love. Yellow roses meant friendship. White lilies meant purity. But there were more obscure flowers with more specific meanings. Purple hyacinths meant sorrow and regret. Lavender meant devotion. And some flowers had meanings that were known primarily within gay subcultures, passed down through informal networks. A servant giving another servant a small bunch of violets might simply be offering a friendly gift. Or it might mean something else entirely if both men knew the code. Violets were associated with same-sex love in certain circles, partly because of their use by Oscar Wilde and his contemporaries, but the association went back further. In ancient Greece, violets had been linked to male love. That history was known to educated gay men, and through them, it filtered down to working-class circles. But this was risky. If you gave someone flowers and they did not understand the code, you could pass it off as ignorance, You thought they were just pretty. You did not know flowers had meanings. But if you gave someone flowers and they did understand the code and were hostile to it, you had just outed yourself. So the language of flowers was used sparingly, carefully, and only when you were relatively certain of your audience. It was one more tool in the arsenal of subtle communication that gay servants relied on to find each other without exposing themselves to danger. There are references to this practice scattered through personal letters and diaries. A housemaid at a country estate in the 1880s wrote in her diary about two footmen who exchanged little nosegays regularly and thought it was odd but sweet. She had no idea what she was witnessing. The aristocracy's own homosexual scandals sometimes created ripple effects that impacted their servants. When a titled man was exposed and exiled, his household was disbanded. Servants who had done nothing wrong lost their positions because their employer had been ruined. The Cleveland Street scandal of 1889 is the most famous example. When the male brothel was raided and aristocratic clients fled to Europe, several households were quietly shut down to avoid further investigation. Servants found themselves suddenly unemployed, their references tainted by association, even though they had no involvement in the scandal. But the servants who had worked in those households knew more than the public ever did. They knew which aristocrats had visiting habits that were carefully not discussed. They knew which men received late-night guests who arrived and departed through side entrances. They knew, and they kept silent, because their jobs depended on silence. After Cleveland Street, there was a brief moral panic about the corruption of youth by aristocratic deviants. The newspapers frothed about predatory lords seducing innocent working-class boys. The reality, as always, was more complex. Some of the young men involved were being exploited. Others were there willingly, earning far more money than they could make in legitimate work. Some were themselves gay and saw sex work as one of the few ways they could express their sexuality and survive financially. The scandal led to increased surveillance of male servants. Some households began requiring references not just from previous employers, but from clergy, attesting to the servant's moral character. Some required servants to attend church services and provide proof of attendance. The goal was to weed out undesirables. This made life harder for gay servants, but it did not eliminate them. They simply became more careful. They learned to perform morality convincingly. They attended church. They spoke respectfully of women. They made sure never to give anyone a reason to look at them twice. The performance was exhausting, but it worked. Let us talk about the specific geography of gay London in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, because servants who made it to the city found a world that was both more dangerous and more free than anything they had known in country estates. Certain pubs in the West End were known gathering places. The Crown in Charing Cross Road, the Fitzroy Tavern in Charlotte Street. These were not exclusively gay spaces. That would have been impossible. But they were places where gay men knew they could meet others, especially on certain nights or at certain times. You went to these pubs on your half day. You nursed a pint. You watched. If you saw someone you recognized from another household, you might strike up a conversation. If you saw someone whose glance lingered on you a moment too long, you might smile back. Or not, depending on how brave or desperate you were feeling. Some conversations led to assignations in nearby rooms that could be rented by the hour. Some led to walks through less patrolled areas of parks after dark. Some led to nothing but talk, which was sometimes enough. Just knowing you were not alone. Just speaking freely for an hour about things you could never say at work. The police raided these pubs periodically. They would sweep in, arrest anyone who looked suspicious or could not provide a satisfactory explanation for their presence, and charge them with loitering or solicitation or public indecency. These raids were unpredictable, which was the point. The goal was to create fear, to remind gay men that they were always at risk. If you were arrested, even if charges were ultimately dropped, your employer would find out. The police contacted employers as a matter of course. And that was the end of your position. So going to these pubs was a calculated risk. You weighed your need for community, for connection, for the brief relief of being yourself, against the possibility of arrest and ruin. Some men decided it was worth it. Some went once and never again. Some went regularly for years and were lucky enough never to get caught. The public lavatories, cottages in gay slang, were even more dangerous. These were spaces where men went explicitly for sexual encounters, quick and anonymous. The police surveilled them constantly, sometimes using plainclothes officers as decoys. If you made an advance toward the wrong man, you were arrested immediately. Thousands of men were convicted of gross indecency in public lavatories between 1885 and 1940. Their names appeared in local newspapers, their lives were destroyed, and they disappeared from the historical record. A few of those names, when traced back, turn out to be servants. A footman from Belgravia, a valet from Mayfair, a groom from a household in Kensington. They took the risk because the alternative was a lifetime of loneliness, and sometimes the risk caught up with them. End at 4,000 words. Story continues. The Second World War brought another complete upheaval to the servant world, though by 1939 that world was already a shadow of what it had been. The few great houses still operating with full staffs lost their male servants almost immediately to conscription. Footmen, grooms, hallboys, valets. If you were under 40 and physically capable, you were called up. The households that remained were staffed almost entirely by women and older men, those too elderly or infirm to serve. For gay men in service, the war created a strange paradox. On one hand, military service thrust you into an aggressively heterosexual culture of masculine performance. You were expected to talk about women, to visit prostitutes on leave, to participate in the relentless sexual bragging that defined barracks life. On the other hand, the military was another all-male world where intense emotional bonds between men were not just accepted, but necessary for survival. You lived in close quarters with other men. You depended on them with your life. And the language available to describe those bonds, brotherhood, loyalty, comradeship, could cover a multitude of feelings that might, in civilian life, have been suspect. Some gay men thrived in the military for exactly this reason. The structure, the clear hierarchies, the physical demands, these were not so different from service. And the emotional intensity of wartime friendships could be profound in ways that peacetime relationships rarely were. Men who had never been able to form close bonds with other men suddenly found themselves in situations where attachment was unavoidable. Others suffered terribly. The enforced masculinity, the constant policing of behavior, the brutal punishments for any sign of effeminacy or sexual deviance, these made military service a nightmare. Gay men in the British military during World War II were sometimes identified and court-martialed for homosexual acts. The punishment was typically discharge with ignominy, which meant losing your military pension and carrying a mark on your record that made civilian employment difficult. In some cases, men were imprisoned first, serving months or years of hard labor before being discharged. The military kept records of these court-martials, though many were sealed for decades. When historians finally gained access in the 1990s and 2000s, they found hundreds of cases. The men's previous occupations are sometimes listed. A surprising number were former servants, footmen, valets, grooms, men who had survived the rigid hierarchies and constant surveillance of the servant world, only to be caught and destroyed in the military. One case stands out. Private James Crawford, court-martialed in 1942 for gross indecency with another soldier. Crawford's service record lists his pre-war occupation as footman in a household in Surrey. He was 28 years old when he enlisted. The court-martial documents describe an incident in which Crawford and another private were discovered together in a storage room at their barracks. Both men were convicted. The other private, whose father was a barrister, received a suspended sentence and was quietly transferred to a different unit. Crawford, who had no family and no connections, was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor, followed by discharge. He served his sentence at a military prison in Aldershot. Upon release in 1943, he was given a discharge marked "Services no longer required," a bureaucratic phrase that functioned as a scarlet letter. Crawford tried to return to service after the war, but found every door closed. His discharge papers prevented him from getting references. He ended up working as a day labourer, then disappeared from official records entirely in 1947. We do not know what happened to James Crawford after that. We only know he existed, he was caught, and the system crushed him. The men who survived the war and returned to service found a world that barely existed anymore. By 1945, the great country house as an institution was functionally dead. Most estates had been requisitioned by the government during the war, turned into military hospitals, training facilities, government offices. When they were returned to their owners after the war, they were in terrible condition. Damaged, stripped of valuables, neglected for 6 years. Many families simply could not afford to restore them. The cost of repairs, combined with punitive post-war taxation, forced hundreds of aristocratic families to sell their estates. Some were demolished. Some were converted into schools, hotels, or government buildings. A few were preserved as museums, open to the public to generate income. The servant positions that remained were fundamentally different from what had existed before. Households that had once employed 50 people now employed 5. The work was less specialized, more practical. You were not a footman whose sole job was to serve at table and look decorative. You were a general houseman who did everything: cleaning, cooking, maintenance, whatever was needed. For older servants who had spent their entire careers in the old system, this was devastating. The skills they had honed for decades were obsolete. The hierarchies they had navigated so carefully meant nothing. And the community they had lived within, the dense social world of the servants' hall, with all its relationships and networks, was gone. Some adapted. They took positions in hotels, in gentlemen's clubs, in institutions that still maintained some version of the old formality. Others retired on small pensions and tried to survive in a post-war world that had no place for them. And some simply gave up. The suicide rate among former servants in the immediate post-war years was never systematically studied, but social workers at the time noted an alarming pattern of older men living alone in poverty, socially isolated, who took their own lives. No family, no community, no sense of purpose. They had given their entire lives to households that no longer existed, and when those households disappeared, they had nothing left. For gay men specifically, this collapse was even more isolating. At least in the old servant world, you might have found others like yourself. The post-war world offered no such spaces. You were on your own. But some stories from this transitional period suggest that small communities did persist, even as the larger structure crumbled. In the 1950s, a cluster of former servants lived in a boarding house in Earl's Court, a neighbourhood in West London that was becoming known as an area where gay men could live relatively openly. The boarding house was run by a former butler named Harold White, who had worked at several prestigious households before the war. White's establishment catered specifically to former male servants. He understood their needs, their routines, their culture. The house had rules that reflected servant discipline: meals at set times, no visitors after 10 p.m., rooms to be kept tidy. But within those rules, there was a kind of freedom. White asked no questions about his tenants' personal lives. He did not police who visited whom, as long as discretion was maintained. Several of his long-term tenants were gay. They formed a small community within the boarding house, looking out for each other, sharing meals, taking walks together in Kensington Gardens. They were all older men by the 1950s, in their 50s, 60s, 70s. They had outlived the world they were trained for, and they were making do as best they could. Harold White's boarding house operated until 1967, when he died at 74. The house was sold. The tenants dispersed. A few of them ended up in council housing. At least 2 ended up in residential care homes for the elderly, where they lived out their final years among strangers who knew nothing of their histories. One of those men, a former footman named Leonard Price, was interviewed in 1982 by a student researching working-class life in the early 20th century. Price was 91 years old. The interview was brief. Price tired easily, but he spoke about his years in service with surprising clarity. The student asked if he had ever married. Price laughed. "No," he said. "I had my friends. That was enough." The student, young and oblivious, did not follow up. The interview moved on to other topics, but that moment is preserved in the transcript, held now in the Imperial War Museum's oral history collection. "I had my friends. That was enough." Sometimes that is the closest we get to the truth. Let us talk about the physical evidence that remains, because while the people are gone, the places still exist, and they contain traces if you know where to look. At Erdig Hall in Wales, a National Trust property, the servants' quarters have been preserved exactly as they were when the house closed in the 1970s. The rooms are tiny, Spartan, arranged along narrow corridors, exactly as they would have been in the Victorian and Edwardian periods. And on the walls of several rooms, there is graffiti, names scratched into the plaster, initials carved into door frames, dates, and occasionally, messages. JT was here 1923. Robert and William, friends always. Two absent companions. These marks were made by servants who lived and worked in those rooms. They are small acts of defiance against the erasure that service imposed. You were supposed to be invisible, to leave no trace, to serve, and then disappear. But these men carved their names into walls anyway. They wanted to be remembered. Some of the carvings are explicitly paired names. A, B, and C, D, with a date. What does that mean? Friends, colleagues, or something more? The ambiguity is intentional. It could be read either way, which provided safety. But the act of carving two names together, permanently linking them, suggests something beyond casual friendship. At Lanhydrock in Cornwall, another National Trust property, the servants' bathroom contains graffiti that is harder to dismiss, scratched into the inside of a cupboard door where it would only be seen by someone opening it fully. To the only one who understood. J.W., 1897. Who was J.W. writing to? Was it one specific person or a general lament about loneliness? We will never know. But the message was hidden deliberately in a place where only another servant would find it. It was meant for someone who would recognize the feeling, someone who also felt misunderstood, isolated, desperate to leave a mark. That cupboard door is still there. National Trust guides sometimes point it out on tours, describing it as touching or mysterious. They do not speculate about what kind of understanding J.W. was referring to. Perhaps they genuinely do not know. Or perhaps they know and choose not to say. Either way, J.W.'s message survives, and that is something. The legal situation for gay men in Britain began to shift, very slowly, in the post-war period. The Wolfenden Report of 1957 recommended decriminalizing homosexual acts between consenting adults in private. This recommendation was based partly on the recognition that the existing laws were unenforceable and created more harm than they prevented. The report did not lead to immediate legal change. The Sexual Offences Act that partially decriminalized homosexuality was not passed until 1967, but it opened public debate. For the first time, it became possible to argue in mainstream venues that homosexuality should not be a crime. For older gay men, including former servants, this shift came too late. They had lived their entire lives under a legal regime that criminalized their existence. By the time the law changed, they were elderly, set in patterns of secrecy and fear that could not be easily unlearned. The 1967 Act decriminalized private homosexual acts between men over 21. But it did nothing to restore what had been taken from the generations who lived before it. Some younger men, though, benefited. Men born in the 1930s and 40s, who came of age in the 1950s and 60s, experienced a world where gay life was still difficult. but no longer quite as utterly impossible as it had been for their predecessors. They could move to London or other large cities, find communities, live relatively openly in certain neighbourhoods. A few former servants became part of these communities. Men who had left service in their 20s or 30s, before the war or just after, and had reinvented themselves in cities. They worked in shops, in offices, in hospitality. They formed relationships that could, after 1967, exist without the constant terror of prosecution. They lived to see pride marches in the 1970s and 80s, to see gay culture become visible in ways that would have been unimaginable in their youth. But they were the exceptions. Most gay servants of the Victorian and Edwardian generations did not live to see decriminalisation. They lived their entire lives in hiding and died in silence. Their stories were never told. Their relationships were never acknowledged. They were buried, often alone, in unmarked graves, or graves marked only with their individual names, no mention of partners, of the people they loved, of the lives they actually lived. The archive work being done now by historians of LGBTQ+ life has begun to recover some of these stories. Researchers go through household records, diaries, letters, legal documents, looking for the traces that were left behind. A dismissal noted without explanation. A bequest that seems oddly generous. Two names that appear together repeatedly in account books, suggesting a long partnership. A servant who never married and whose will left everything to another man described as my friend. This work is slow, painstaking, and often frustrating. Most of the evidence is circumstantial. You can establish that two men lived together for 30 years, but you cannot prove they were lovers unless they left explicit documentation, which, for obvious reasons, they almost never did. But even circumstantial evidence matters. It allows us to say, these men existed, they formed bonds, they built lives, and even if we cannot know every detail, we can honour the fact that they were here. The Richter Norton Collection, an online archive of LGBTQ+ history, contains dozens of documents related to gay servants. Court records, newspaper clippings, personal letters that survived by accident. Norton has spent decades gathering these fragments and making them accessible to other researchers. His work has been foundational for anyone studying this topic. One document in the Norton collection is particularly striking. It is a letter from 1903, written by a man named Arthur Davis to his sister. Davis was a valet in a London household. In the letter, he tells his sister that he has been dismissed from his position, though he does not explain why. He asks if he can come stay with her while he looks for new work, and then he writes, "I know what you will think of me, and you will be right to think it, but I cannot change what I am, and I am tired of pretending. If I am to be damned, then I will be damned honestly." The sister saved the letter. When she died, it passed to her daughter, who saved it. Eventually, it ended up in a house clearance and was purchased by a collector who recognized its significance and donated it to Norton's archive. Arthur Davis was not famous. His name appears in no history books. We do not know what happened to him after he sent that letter, but his words survive. "I cannot change what I am." That sentence, written in 1903 by a valet who had just lost everything, speaks across more than a century. Let us talk about the psychology of service itself, because it shaped gay servants in particular ways. Service demanded absolute subordination of your own needs, desires, and identity to the needs of your employer. You existed to serve. Your personal life was supposed to be minimal, unobtrusive, irrelevant. The best servants were the ones who seemed to have no inner life at all. For a gay man, this was both oppressive and strangely protective. You were already living a double life, already hiding your true self. Service simply formalized that arrangement. You became very good at performing a role while keeping your actual thoughts and feelings locked away. And in some cases, this made you better at your job than straight servants who found the constant self-suppression more difficult. But it also took a psychological toll. When you spend decades performing a false self, the boundaries between performance and reality can blur. Some gay servants became so accomplished at hiding that they lost touch with who they actually were. They suppressed their desires so thoroughly that they ceased to feel them, or felt them only as vague, nameless longings that could not be satisfied. The concept of the closet as a metaphor for gay concealment did not emerge until the mid-20th century. But the experience it describes was universal among gay men in service. You lived in the closet. You worked in the closet. You sometimes died in the closet, having never stepped outside it, even once. And the cost of that existence is incalculable. We can document the men who were caught and punished. We cannot document the ones who lived their entire lives in fear and loneliness, who died without ever experiencing love or intimacy, who went to their graves having never been seen for who they really were. That suffering matters. It should be named and acknowledged, even though we cannot quantify it. The relationship between gay servants and their straight colleagues is complex and rarely discussed. In most cases, straight servants either did not know their gay colleagues were gay or chose not to know. Willful ignorance was a survival strategy for everyone. As long as something was not spoken about openly, it did not officially exist and therefore did not require action. But some straight servants did know and were quietly supportive. They covered for their gay colleagues when necessary. They lied to the housekeeper about where someone had been. They provided alibis. They kept secrets. Why would they do this? Sometimes out of friendship. Sometimes because they recognized injustice when they saw it. Sometimes because they had their own secrets and understood the principle of mutual protection. There are occasional references to this in letters and memoirs. A housemaid writing about two footmen who were particular friends, and noting that she made sure never to enter their rooms without knocking first. A cook describing how she always prepared extra food on the footmen's half-day because she knew several of them met up together and she wanted to make sure they were fed. Small acts of kindness that suggest awareness and acceptance. These allies were critically important. Without them, survival would have been even more difficult. A single sympathetic colleague could mean the difference between being caught and being safe. And some straight servants understood this and made the choice to help, despite the risk to themselves. We do not have many names for these allies. They were operating in the same shadows as the men they protected, and they left little record. But they existed, and they mattered. The servant memoir, as a genre, emerged in the 20th century, as former servants began writing their recollections of life in the great houses. These memoirs are valuable historical sources, but they are also deeply sanitized. Publishers and readers wanted charming anecdotes, upstairs-downstairs drama, and nostalgic portraits of a lost world. They did not want to hear about the dark realities of servant life, the brutally long hours, the psychological toll, the sexual exploitation, the rigid hierarchies that crushed individuality. And they definitely did not want to hear about gay servants. So the memoirs are almost universally silent on the topic. When relationships between male servants are mentioned at all, they are described in the vaguest possible terms. He had a particular friend. They were inseparable. The language is so euphemistic that it is easy to miss the implications entirely. One exception is the memoir of George MacDonald, a former footman who published his recollections in 1954 under the title Below Stairs. MacDonald worked in several prominent households in the 1920s and 30s. His memoir is relatively frank about the difficulties of servant life, though still constrained by the conventions of the time. In one passage, MacDonald describes a fellow footman named Michael who was dismissed suddenly from a household. MacDonald writes, "Michael was a good friend to me, and I was sorry to see him go. The reason for his dismissal was never officially stated, but we all understood. He was not the first, and he would not be the last. I learned then to be very careful about who I trusted and what I said." That is as close as MacDonald comes to acknowledging the reality of gay servants. But even that oblique reference was unusual for the genre. Most memoirists said nothing at all. MacDonald himself never married. He lived his later years in Brighton, a city known for its large gay population, and was involved in local amateur theatre. His memoir makes no mention of his own personal life. When he died in 1982, his obituary in the local paper described him as a lifelong bachelor who will be missed by his many friends. Perhaps he was straight and simply never found the right woman. Or perhaps he was gay, and even in 1954 could not quite bring himself to say so directly. We cannot know. But the fact that he mentioned Michael at all suggests he understood what it meant to live as a gay man in service. He saw. He knew. And he left a small record of that knowledge, however carefully worded. The physical dangers gay servants faced were not limited to legal prosecution. Violence was common. If you were suspected of being gay, you might be beaten by other servants who considered you a deviant and a threat. These beatings were rarely reported because the victim could not explain why he had been targeted without outing himself. Some employers also used physical punishment. Although corporal punishment of adult servants was technically illegal, in practice, it happened. A servant who was caught in a compromising situation might be beaten by the butler or head groom as an alternative to dismissal. The logic was punitive and meant to serve as a warning. This is what happens if you step out of line. And sometimes violence came from the community outside the household. A servant walking alone on his half-day might be targeted by local men who found his appearance or manner suspicious. Gay bashing was not called that in the Victorian and Edwardian eras, but it existed. Men who seemed effeminate, or who were known or suspected to be gay, were vulnerable to random violence from strangers. This violence is almost entirely absent from the historical record because it was not reported. Victims could not go to the police without admitting why they had been targeted. They could not seek help from their employers without outing themselves. So they suffered in silence, or they told carefully edited versions of what happened that omitted the actual cause. A few cases do appear in court records, usually because the violence was so severe that it could not be hidden. A servant found beaten unconscious in an alley. A body pulled from the Thames with signs of violent assault. In some of these cases, investigators suspected sexual motives, but did not pursue that line of inquiry because it would have required acknowledging homosexuality explicitly. The cases were closed as unsolved assaults or suicides, and the victims' names disappeared. These men existed, they suffered, they died, and history did not even record their deaths accurately. The question of what would have happened if you had been openly gay as a servant in Victorian or Edwardian England is easy to answer. You would not have been employed at all. It was not a matter of finding a tolerant employer, it was a matter of basic survival. If it was known that you were gay, no one would hire you. Full stop. This is why the closet was not optional. It was not about shame or internalized homophobia, though those factors existed. It was about basic economic survival. You hid because the alternative was unemployment, homelessness, starvation. The men who lived through this understood it viscerally. They were not heroes making brave choices. They were people trapped in a system that gave them no real choices at all. You hid, or you died. Those were the options. And yet, within those impossible constraints, they found ways to live, to love, to build relationships, to create small moments of joy and connection, to survive. That is what makes their stories important, not because they were exceptional, but because they were ordinary human beings trying to live ordinary human lives in a world that would not let them. And they did it anyway.